So we're back in action with our little scene here with our geometry, and I'd like to show you how we've implemented shadow casting inside of Action in this release. So it's a long overdue feature, but I think that we've come up actually with something that's provides like a really wide range of possibilities for the users and options to select from depending on what you're trying to do. So in the node bin inside of Action, in the relighting tab, you will find that there's a new object that's called shadowcast, okay? Not to be mistaken with the legacy shadows that are only just a 2D effect, an offset effect that you already know. The shadowcast object is something that will actually really attempt to simulate lights that get projected onto the environment and will react consistently with the position of the light. So how do you use them? Well, in my schematic, if I have a light that's selected, I simply need to drag the shadow cast and it will parent automatically to the light. If I double click on it, it will actually present me with its UI. And so by default, if you start a new project, the shadows will initialize them in what we call 2.5D shadows. There are 3 different types of shadows inside of Action, and we'll go over what makes them different, each different. 2.5D shadow, again, is the option by default, which typically is kind of the best compromise. If I switch to my result here, I see something that's obviously very dark, but I can change the transparency to make it what I want. And as I start moving my light around, okay, you will see that I get something that's actually a shadow that seems to be consistently moving with the position of the light. But the one thing that 2.5D shadows don't necessarily generate is what you would call self-shadowing. So if you look at my text object, okay, even though it is shaded, you will never see the text cast shadow onto itself. This is a limitation of the technique, but on the other hand, 2.5D shadows tend to be relatively interactive and easy to manipulate and kind of predictable. They also have like an explicit softness parameter that you can control that immediately yields results, and again, as I said, a transparency parameter here that actually is common to all the shadows. So every shadow type can have a specific color that's assigned to it. And another thing that I want to draw your attention to is that shadows actually internally generate like an intermediate image. In the context of a 2.5D shadow, it's a sort of image that will get projected onto the surrounding environment, and that intermediate image actually has a resolution. So by default, it is set to 512 times 512, and in some instances, it can actually be not enough. So keep in mind that you can crank this up to 2K. Which will then give you like a higher precision. Of course, sometimes you will find that it's a good enough compromise to keep them at their default value and use the softness. It's actually up to you to decide what's the best compromise to fit your needs. So as you see here, these are really shadows that exist in 3D space. And again, as I move my light around, they are getting consistently cast inside of the environment. So that's kind of cool. But so let's see what other types of shadows we have. And so the other types that I have are 3D soft shadows and 3D hard shadows. So both are 3D shadows, and the biggest difference between 2.5D and 3D is the fact that 3D shadows, whether they're soft or hard shadows, can actually support self-shadowing on geometry objects. So let's switch to 3D soft shadows. And what you will see is that as I selected this in the pop-up, my shadows apparently disappeared. And this is because I just switched my current comp output to render 3D soft shadows. And right now, I only have a 2.5D shadow. So I'm going to switch my shadow cast type to 3D soft shadow. So now what I see is I have my current comp output that is set to render soft shadows and my current shadow caster that is set to generate soft shadows. So now I can see them. It's important for people to understand that a comp output can only render one specific type of shadows at a time. Okay, you can have as many outputs from action as you want, and they can all be set to support different shadow types, but only one particular shadow type can be rendered in a specific output at any given time. So it's important, if you want to see what you're working on, to make sure that those two pop-ups are set to the same option. Okay, so what happens now with my 3D soft shadow is you will see an interesting thing that I can still, change the transparency of my shadow here. I can still adjust the color, so this is completely common to all the shadow types. But the interesting thing now is that if I start moving my light around, you will notice that the text is now casting shadow over itself. As I move my light up and down, it's actually generating shadows on top of itself. So this is something that, again, is exclusive to 3D shadow types. So the 3D soft shadows are interesting because they provide you with an explicit softness parameter. However, we will see that one of the limitations that they have is that they cannot accurately reproduce something that you see in real life, which is the penumbra effect. The penumbra effect is the effect that you see when a shadow becomes blurrier as the distance grows, as it moves away from the actual shadow caster. And this is something that 3D hard shadows can actually simulate. So let's switch to 3D hard shadows and take a look at that. So you will see that the parameters here have changed between the soft shadows, but you see now that instead of actually having an explicit softness control, I now have a penumbra control. And what the penumbra is going to do is actually simulate this gradual blurriness that is much less important here than it is here at the extremity of the shadow. So you see every shadow type actually has its advantages, and it's important for you to understand that 3D hard shadows are definitely the most taxing of all the 3D of all the shadow types that are available to you. So in order of actual intensiveness for the GPU, you have the 2.5D, the 3D soft shadows, and the 3D hard shadows. Okay, so depending on what you want to do, you have all the options that are there for you, and you can decide what's the best for you. Another important thing to understand is, again, 3D, whether soft shadows or hard shadows, also have a resolution. This is the resolution of the internal occlusion map that is being generated from the point of view of the light to determine exactly what is being seen by the light. Okay. Now, of course, if this is left to 512, in some instances, it will actually cause jagginess. Another important thing to understand is if you move the light around, an occlusion map can potentially cause some amount of jittering as the occlusion is being recalculated as you move the light into 3D space. Now, there are two things that you can do to compensate for that. The first one is to crank up the resolution of the actual occlusion pass, and again, the limit is 2K. And the other thing that you can do is also crank up an anti-aliasing parameter that only has an effect on the rendered images. This can go up to 8 samples. It is not necessary to use this if you only have static lights and no motion. Only use this if you're moving lights around and you're noticing that your shadows are kind of jittery. So you can combine both of these things to get smooth shadow motion when you're moving lights around into your scene. Let's get back to something that is very specific to 2.5D shadows. So as I said, 3D shadows are very good for self-shadowing, but if you're using, if your intention is to actually use shadows also with 2D elements that may have an alpha, there are limitations with 3D shadows that are difficult to overcome. And one of them is that since they're actually occlusion-based, they calculate internally a z-depth pass that will present a fair amount of jagginess, especially if you have an alpha channel. So in my scene, actually, I have right now a 2D key here. Now what you will see is that as I move my light around, so this is really a 2D layer that I have in my 3D space. Okay, it's a bunch of people jumping up and down because they're happy we have shadows now inside of Action. And so the interesting thing about 2.5D shadows is that they will actually very faithfully respect the transparencies of your alpha channel. 3D shadows, on the other hand, because they're occlusion-based, will not respect transparencies in a very elegant way. So this is something that you need to take into consideration. And I'm going to try to illustrate this. If I switch to 3D hard shadows, you will see here that all of a sudden a whole bunch of things happen. All the things that are semi-transparent in my key are all of a sudden appearing as being completely opaque, okay? And again, this is because internally the light is calculating an occlusion pass, and occlusion passes don't necessarily deal very well with alpha channel. To compensate for this, there is a matte threshold parameter that is available for all 3D shadows. This will allow you to determine, and this is really purely true or false. It's very binary. It's a threshold that will either make pixels entirely transparent or entirely opaque, and you can change that threshold. And as you see, as I do this, I kind of get like a slightly better rendition. But as you see here, on the shadows on my text object, they're still very, very, very jaggy. So one thing to understand about the specific advantage of 2.5D shadows is that they're very good with anything that has an alpha channel, whether it's a smoke element with lots of subtle transparencies. They will properly get cast by in 2.5D shadows, but not very well with the 3D shadows. So think about it when you create your shadow strategy. Another thing to look at for, so let me just hide this particular layer for now, and there I go. Again, moving my light around. Okay, so let me bring it back into the back of my room here. So one thing that also Action supports is a shadow output. So in the output list right now, you have the ability to actually create what you call a shadow output, and again here, so there's an extra type that's been added, which is which stands for shadows, and a shadow output also needs to be told what type of shadows it's supposed to generate. So here, since my shadowcaster is set to hard shadows, now I have to make sure that my shadow output is also set to render the same type of shadows that my scene has. And what this will actually give you is, again, an output where you can actually see the shadow component inside of your scene. So I'm moving my light around, so you see the self-shadowing effect that's going on here. Okay, and so on top of that, the interesting thing that I can do is actually add also what you call a bilateral filtering, which is an adaptive filtering which will cause an extra amount of filtering on the output, exclusively on the output, that will have like a pleasing gradual blur that varies depending on the distance to the actual light and the object. So it's something to keep in mind. This is something that will only get processed in a shadow output, not in the comp output. Of course, as a consequence, in the comp outputs, you can go ahead and actually exclude your shadows so that you can recomp them after the fact. So again, if I select Alt-E, I can go ahead and exclude that from my comp output. And as you see, my shadows are gone, but they're still present in my shadow outputs for comping later on in the pipeline if this is something that I'm interested in. So anyway, an extra output that's there. Something else that I'd like to point out, and so let me revert back to how it was before. So in my comp output, I'm going to include again the shadow here. Something else to look out for is the fact that within every single object, and actually I can actually choose whether there are extra options now that appear to determine how they should deal with shadows. And by default, any object that you add in your scene is set to cast and receive. But I can decide to turn the object as invisible and only have it cast a shadow. So it is still going to react to the light, but the only thing that I'll ever see is the actual shadow. So again, a lot of flexibility here, and for every single object you can determine whether it should cast and receive shadows, only receive, only cast, or only expose the shadow that it casts while being invisible. So again, lots of options there that you can combine together.